your MC for today. A few housekeeping notes before we start the webinar proper. Please have your camera off and your mics muted. There will be a Q&A session after the talk, so please feel free to post your questions in the chat box as the presentation proceeds. Also, this webinar will be recorded and posted online. Today, we are very fortunate to have the author of the book, China for SMEs, Daryl Guppy, with us. He will explore the relevant cultural aspects of business in China, including the Belt and Road Initiative framework, which have become even more important post-COVID. Today's webinar will discuss how these have evolved, which practices and attitudes remain unchanged, and those which have become more important. Mr. Daryl Guppy is a national board member of the Australia-China Business Council, which provides advice to Australian government at high levels on commercial and political cooperation with China. He has advised political leaders on China matters. He speaks at China ASEAN and APEC conferences, as well as in China, Singapore, and Australia on Belt and Road Initiative policies. He provides China analysis to Chinese and ASEAN media, and he is the author of the book, China for SMEs, Essential Elements of Success. And now, let me hand the time over to Mr. Guppy to kick things off.
Thank you, Anne. And thank you for people attending. For some, it's good morning, for some, it's good evening, and for some, it's good afternoon. Post-COVID China presents new challenges for anybody that is either doing business in China or thinking of doing business in China. Those are the sorts of issues that I want to discuss this evening. I want to look at several issues. First of all, the foundation environment, the way that the operating environment in China has changed, and the modifications or adjustments that we need to make, particularly as small and medium enterprises, because the world is very, very different for SMEs in China compared to the advantages that are enjoyed by the big international, well-known and recognized names. What we find is that size matters. And there are some ways, which we will discuss later, of how you can use your smaller size to particular advantage. Part of that is around some cultural things, North versus South, the way that behaviors change depending on which regions you're working in China. Because although our focus tends to be on Beijing and Shanghai and Guangzhou, the reality is that they represent only a small portion of the business opportunities within China. Moving into the Western regions, moving further to the Northern regions, offer a whole range of different opportunities in a different way of operating. We need to understand those cultural differences because China is not just a single unit. Part of what I'll talk about this evening is meetings, how we go into meetings and how we can make the best use of meetings and how we identify them. But also, I will finish looking at the tigers and flies policies. These are important because they help set the background. The way you do business in China now under Xi Jinping is very different to the way you did business 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So let's look at the foundation. There is a narrative in the Western media in particular that suggests that somehow the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, does not enjoy the support of the people. There is a narrative, particularly from the far-right media, that dominates the American news cycles and to a lesser extent the Australian and the European news cycles. There is this feeling that somehow China's leadership and government is not legitimate because it's not democratic, and that its aspirations are not legitimate. That is not the way that the general population thinks. And this is perhaps one of the most important foundational thinkings that we have to bring to our engagement with China. For many people, for the vast majority of people, the Chinese Communist Party has delivered prosperity. Yes, as the 100-year celebrations have told us, they've made mistakes, and they will gloss over those. People cannot forget the rigors of the Cultural Revolution. And if you are dealing with people in their 60s and in their 50s, and these are some of the most powerful decision makers, then their thinking has been formed by the Cultural Revolution. But for the new generation of consumers and of entrepreneurs, the Communist Party has delivered prosperity. This is an environment, this is a society where they firmly believe that their children will enjoy better living conditions than they do, just as they have enjoyed better living conditions than their parents did. This aspiration, this optimism about the future no longer is restricted to Europe and America, and in many ways has disappeared from the American dream and the European dream. So you need to be very careful when engaging with your Chinese counterparties, not to give the impression that somehow the Chinese government doesn't have legitimacy, that the Chinese government does not enjoy the support, the overwhelming support of the population. That's probably the most important step in the first place, because people will pick up very quickly what your opinions are. Because in a country that is defined by the rule of regulation, as distinct from the rule of law, the ability to understand what your counterparties are thinking and behaving is critical. And your counterparty in China has developed that skill as a survival mechanism, both on a personal level and a business level, over his entire lifetime. So they will very quickly pick up whether you are genuine or false. So that's the first part of the operating environment. And it has become particularly stronger around the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of China, around the 70th anniversary events, and so on. There is an increase in nationalism. There's an increase in pride in China and China's place in the world that wasn't there 5 or 10 years ago. And Xi Jinping has made that much more obvious. And amongst the general population, amongst your business partners, there is that pride that's sitting there in place. They are no longer prepared to be in an environment where they are exploited. So for many, the Communist Party is the Tao. The Communist Party is the way. You're not going to change that thinking. We need to accept it. You don't have to agree with it, but you need to accept it and not to challenge it. It smooths the way for business operations. So that's the first part of the foundation that we need to take in our engagement in China. The second part relates to the historical context, and it's part of the narrative that Xi Jinping has been developing. And the West rolls their eyes every time Xi Jinping talks about the century of humiliation, about events that happened in the 1860s, the First Opium War, the Second Opium War, the opening up of the treaty ports, the disintegration of China and its domination by colonial powers up until the collapse of the Qing dynasty at the turn of the century, and then that warlord period. And from a Western perspective, we tend to roll our eyes. Stop going on about it. But this period of history still exerts tremendous influence on the United States. This recent rally taken in the last days of the Trump presidency show the Confederate flags still flying in the southern parts of America. The wounds that were inflicted in the Civil War still run deep. The Black Lives Matter movement draws on the unresolved issues from the Civil War period. And we accept that. We accept that as reasonable. Within the United States political system, we accept that these are legitimate concerns, that they have a role to play in American current everyday politics. But the events of the Civil War took place at essentially, not exactly, but essentially the same time as the Opium Wars. The century of humiliation that Xi Jinping talks about closely matches the lingering discontent that comes from the Civil War in America. So, if it is reasonable to accept the influence of the Civil War and the Confederacy on current modern American politics, then it is equally as reasonable to accept the thinking and the influence of the Opium Wars, the century's humiliation, on the development of China. These historical antecedents, these historical pressures, are just as strong in both political environments. Now, we don't have to be involved in those discussions, and in fact, it's very unwise to be involved in those political discussions. However, we need to acknowledge the legitimacy of those discussions and the legitimacy of that historical impact on contemporary politics and contemporary movements. If you're working in the southern states, the ex-Confederate states of the United States, it would be unwise to make comments about the Confederacy and whether it was a good thing or a bad thing and Black Lives Matter, etc. You would temper your statements exactly the same as you need to temper your statements when you're operating within a Chinese environment. These historical events are real and continue to have a substantial impact on the way that people view the world. It applies in the US just as much as it applies in China. The difference is perhaps that we know more about the Civil War in the United States than we know about the Opium Wars in China. So the first foundation of thinking is to reject the narrative that the Chinese government is not supported by the people and that it's somehow not legitimate. The second foundation is to accept the role that historical impacts continue to play in forming and structuring contemporary political discussions and events. That's the background against which we work. The third part of that background is Belt and Road, the Belt and Road Initiative, the New Silk Road, the Maritime Silk Road. It's undergone a range of name changes as this program has evolved. Of course, at the G7 meeting, President Biden introduced the concept of a blue dot network in competition to, let's call it, the red dot network of the Belt and Road Initiative. And the focus of the blue dot network is on physical infrastructure, not so much on soft diplomacy. And that in itself represents a misunderstanding of what the Belt and Road Initiative is about. Again, the common narrative in the Western media is that Belt and Road is primarily about building ports and railways and highways, hard physical infrastructure. In fact, there are four major elements in the Belt and Road Initiative. And it's important to understand these because Belt and Road remains a central policy directive of the central government. Every province, every city, every major business, the business that you're likely to do business with, has a Belt and Road policy. And the reason for that is that by adopting a Belt and Road policy, it gives business access to faster loans, to faster investment approvals. For businesses that are looking to expand overseas and invest overseas, and if you're looking to attract that investment, then if they can frame the proposal within the framework of Belt and Road, Their investment requests, their requests to move money overseas goes to the top of the line because it's compatible with national policy. China is an autocracy. It's a country that is dominated by a single party. There is no escaping that. That means that when the central government sets policy, everybody else has to follow. So if we can frame our relationships in ways that are compatible with that central policy, then we improve our business and we improve the potential to be able to attract investment overseas. So there are four legs, four parts of Belt and Road. The first, which is the most commonly known and talked about, is physical infrastructure. It's the roads, it's the bridges, it's the railways, it's the ports. But alongside that is a trade infrastructure. And the trade infrastructure is about the regulatory environment. It's about the trade settlement processes. It's about the regulatory harmonization of cross-border trade with all of China's trading partners. Essential to that is the use of blockchain and changes in payment systems and protocols. That whole ecosystem changes. It seeks to reduce the reliance on the SWIFT dollar settlement system, which is not only dominated by the United States, but is to a large extent controlled by the United States. The clearing that takes place within the US for transactions with US dollars is a point of vulnerability for China and its trade partners. It recognizes that. So you have a whole range of developments that are taking place around the trade infrastructure. And we see this with the BRI relations with its trading partners within Asia and across Central Asia and into Europe. Central to that is blockchain and blockchain technology and blockchain certification that underpins the development of the DCEP, the development of the digital RMB. And that's part of the soft infrastructure development. So the first leg of BRI is the physical infrastructure. The second is trade infrastructure. The third is soft infrastructure. And soft infrastructure combined with all of these, because if you put a fast train running from Yunnan to Kuala Lumpur, for instance, then not only do you have that hard infrastructure of the train, you also have the soft infrastructure that controls the ticketing, that controls the construction techniques and protocols, that controls the coordination protocols across the rail network, etc. There's a soft infrastructure that comes with it. Huawei, 5G, artificial intelligence are all part of this soft infrastructure buildup. Now, Biden, to some extent, is becoming more aware of the challenge that is posed by this separation of soft infrastructure systems. We need to understand it. If we're doing business in China, if we are engaging with China, we need to understand the systems that they're operating in terms of payment systems, be it by using WeChat, for instance, the protocols that are involved in that, the way in which blockchain certification underpins a whole range of transactions and processes, so that we can develop software and approaches that are compatible with those BRI objectives. The fourth part of BRI, the fourth leg, is capital infrastructure. And that's in relation to equity markets, to debt markets, as well as DCEP, the digital yuan being used as investment currency, etc. So BRI is more complex than just physical infrastructure. Each company that you deal with will have a BRI strategy that seeks to weld what the company is doing in a way that is consistent with the national objectives. But beyond that, each company that you're operating with or interacting with, each service delivery, each product delivery that you want to put into China will run into BRI in terms of the payment systems, in terms of the certification, For instance, to prove something's clean and green, the blockchain structures that are used with that are compatible with the Chinese protocols and compatible with the Chinese method. So it means, for instance, that Chilean beef, which is consistent and uses the current BRI quarantine protocols, goes to the front of the line when it comes to quarantine clearance, whereas Australian beef, which is yet to adopt those protocols, stays at the back of the line because it uses different approaches. Becoming consistent with BRI protocols, understanding what's involved with that, moving beyond the hype that we see in the Western press that it's all about infrastructure and military domination. The reality is that when we deal with our Chinese counterparts at a business level, they are already operating within that BRI environment. Our task is to understand it, to work with it, not work against it. So that's a strategic background. So let's bring it down a little bit to what we need to do. The first function is size. And that is a major disadvantage from an SME perspective. The right-hand side shows what China considers to be an SME. An SME may have several thousand employees. And in terms of Chinese businesses, that's particularly small. That is an SME, a small to medium enterprise. Whereas the SME in the Western context, at one extreme, may only have half a dozen employees. I work with an SME in Singapore, and we have China engagement. Our total office staff is 20 people. Our SME counterpart in China has a staff of 1,500. So the question becomes for your Chinese counterpart, how can they accept you, given your small size, as a genuine and reliable business partner? Because a company with 10 employees or 20 employees or 30 employees, although it may be a successful SME in a Western context, is nothing more than the equivalent of what the Americans call a mum and pop business in the United States. And there are hundreds of thousands of those within China, and they are so small that no one really wants to do business with them. If we accept, as we often do, that the failure rate for business startups in the Western world runs at somewhere around 70%, then put that into a China context where you're dealing with small companies of 10 or 20 or 30 people, and the failure rate becomes exceptionally large just in terms of numbers. So the Chinese SME, and that's who you are most likely to be doing business with, looks at your smaller numbers and says, I can't afford to take the risk. These are too small. The company is too small to be worth worrying about. The company is too small to be reliable or trustworthy. So how do we overcome that? And there are a couple of ways. One of the most important ways of overcoming that is being able to use your national trade organizations to stand behind you. Participation in trade expos in China is essential because it's through trade expos that the Chinese side comes to understand and to explore potential partners. Unless you are Chinese and have Chinese contacts within mainland China, then entering the China market depends on your ability to make cold contact with a range of potential opportunity partners. And this comes through the trade organisations. Within Australia, it's Austrade. Within the UK, there's a British Trade Commission. Within Singapore, there's Singapore SBC, Singapore Business Federation, that will do that sort of work. The important thing is that when you attend a trade exhibition in China, The audience includes, the foot traffic includes, Chinese businesses who are looking for partners. If your business, the stand that you take in a Chinese trade show, has the backing of, or gives the appearance of having the backing of being associated with your country's trade organizations, with your country's government, with your state's government, then instantly you gain a level of credibility that is much larger than you would be possibly able to achieve if you just represented yourself. From the Chinese perspective, they assume that if you are working with government, you have government backing, that you therefore have government support, that you therefore bring with it some level of government guarantee. Now that is incorrect. But when you're trying to break into the market, that's an essential advantage that comes from participation in these trade expos alongside your country's trade organization or your state's trade organization. The biggest single hurdle that we have to face moving into a China business environment is our size. We have to be able to overcome this by creating, I won't say a false impression of size, but by magnifying our size as much as possible, because we do not have the advantage of being backed by a large multinational. We're not a Deloitte. We're not a Barclays Bank. We're not a Bank of America. We're not a Microsoft. We tend to be a small SME operating in this environment. And that's one of the key points. That is the key point of my book, to look at ways in which SMEs operate within the Chinese business environment to overcome the disadvantages of our smaller comparative size compared to the partners that we are courting. Now, of course, there are two ways of doing business. There always is. There can be just the straight exchange of money. And that goes quite happily for many, many years. But you never get to enjoy the advantages of a strong and genuine business relationship that comes from friendship and from agreement. People talk about guanxi, about relationships. They are essential for long-term sustainable business in China. Remember, we talked about China being subject to the rule of regulation as distinct from the rule of law. And when you're subject to the rule of regulation, then what it means is that the regulation may be interpreted differently in different locations and differently at different times. It's not a single unbending interpretation of law as we are accustomed to in, say, the United States, Australia, the UK, Europe, Singapore, etc. So in that environment, from a Chinese perspective, when they're doing business within China, they have to be able to accurately assess those shifts and changes that are taking place. And that rests on relationships, on friendships, on networking. Our objective as an SME is to understand that networking and to become involved in it. We will never move to the inner circle, but if we are always remain entirely on the outer, then all we will have is a money relationship and not an expanding business relationship. So that's the first aspect. The second aspect is the difference between the North and the South. These differences still remain in place. You can identify at the table who is from the South, who is from the North. Northern Chinese, let's use Beijing as the example, still see themselves as more powerful and as the seat of power and more sophisticated than elsewhere in China. This is important because for many of us, particularly from the Western environment, our thinking about China, and particularly China dining habits and eating habits, is formed essentially from our local Chinese restaurant. Now, that's not an exaggeration. That's often our first contact with the Chinese environment. And it doesn't matter if you're sitting in Singapore or Malaysia, it still remains the same. And that Chinese restaurant draws particularly on Southern dining traditions. The diaspora that came out of Fujian, the Hakka, the Cantonese, define the Chinese experience for most Westerners. There are two ways of pointing to the difference. On the top left-hand corner, there's a cup of a black liquid, and on the top right-hand corner, a cup of, let's call it red or brown liquid. They are both vinegars. If you're eating in Hong Kong or in Guangzhou or in southern China, if you're eating in Singapore or Malaysia, you are most likely to be served with red vinegar to go with your meal. It's a little bit sweeter. But in northern China, you will be served with black vinegar. It's much stronger. It's much more astringent. It's more like Italian vinegar in many ways. One of the things that we would do in introducing politicians to northern dining habits would be to put out a plate of dumplings and a plate or a bowl of black vinegar. Most people would assume it was soy sauce and treat it accordingly. Their looks on the face when they ate the vinegar and realized that it was vinegar was quite interesting. However, it underscored the point. The habits between North and South, between East and West China are very, very different. The habits of eating, the type of food that's eating is very different. In southern China, it's primarily rice-based. In northern China, it's primarily wheat-based. Wheat that feeds into noodles. The common Chinese saying is that no meal is complete without rice. In southern China, that means that rice is served throughout the meal. In northern China, it means that rice ends or completes the meal. Rice is served at the end of the meal as a starch, and you usually have a choice of rice or of noodles. It's not eaten generally throughout the meal. The same applies to drinking habits. Now, the question is, are these differences important? Some people say, not particularly important. But understanding these differences, understanding the regal approach of northern China, gives you an advantage. Remember, you're small. Your SME is not large. You can't bully your partners. You are negotiating from a position of weakness. So every advantage that you can get is yours to take, no matter how small. If you show that you understand the behaviors, you understand the protocols, you understand the steps, the courtesies that surround a northern Chinese meal versus a southern Chinese meal, then you have an advantage over your competitors. Because if you're trying to do business with someone in China, you can be guaranteed that there are at least 3 or 4 others who are also trying to do similar business. You are at a disadvantage because you are a Westerner trying to move into that environment. So there are some key differences in the protocols of eating, and meals are particularly important when it comes to banquets, when it comes to casual meals. Eating is still all about enjoyment. It's not formalized like in Japan. But the manners and the courtesies that apply between North and South vary considerably. We'll look at that in a little bit more detail in China for SMEs. And that's based on the training, the introduction training that we give to politicians who are going to China for the first time, and particularly going to northern China for the first time. Meetings are important. Not because of what they say, obviously, but because of what they say subtly. China is a classless society, but it's a society where class, where hierarchy is particularly important. If you are traveling with a delegation, then it is essential that you know exactly who is the most important and the least important person within that delegation, and all of those positions in between. It's fascinating to watch a Chinese delegation move into a meeting room and a European delegation move into a meeting room. The European delegation is all too often like a mob of sheep. They're all over the place. There's no way to tell who is the leader, who is important, who is not important. So what we find in a meeting situation, whether it be around a table, as it is on the left-hand side, or whether it be in a meeting hall, as it is on the right-hand side, then you can immediately tell who is the senior person in the room and who is the most junior person in the room, and all of those in between. Let's take the diagram on the right-hand side. Typically, what will happen is that, typically what will happen is that the two leaders will sit side by side. The Chinese side will move down from the second most senior person to the least senior person. And they will assume that the person opposite them is also the second most senior person and the least senior person in the room as you move down. Now, because often, not always, but often, the Western delegation takes up positions pretty much like a mob of sheep, there is often a mixture of people, a mismatch of people along the table here on the European side. So the next most important person might be sitting here or even here, rather than in the strict hierarchical order that the Chinese are accustomed to. Now, we see this when we issue invitation lists. When the Chinese side lists their delegation, the members of the delegation, it will include everybody in the order of seniority, not in alphabetical order. But the list that we send to the Chinese side most often is listed at the top, the most important person, and thereafter in alphabetical order rather than in order of seniority. So when the Chinese come to arrange the seating at a banquet, as on the left-hand side diagram, they will work off that sheet, which means that the most important people may be scattered throughout the seating. But the Chinese will assume that the most important person on their side is in the middle, and then on their left, then on their right, left, right, in descending order. The assumption is, on the European side, that the person sitting here will be of equal status to the person sitting here on the Chinese side, that the person sitting next to the head person will also be number two on both sides. So there's a strict hierarchical structure. It's not just for meetings. One of the most confusing things that Europeans can do is get into a lift with a Chinese delegation. Because whether you notice it or not, the Chinese delegation will line up to enter the lift in order of seniority. The most important person will enter the lift first, and the least important person will enter last. And they anticipate that the European side will do the same. And when the European gentleman says, no, ladies first, what he does is completely destroy that strict order of seniority that goes in, and confusion results. Now, this you see more often in Beijing, in northern China, than you do in Shanghai, where people are more accustomed to Western Western approaches and customs. But the strict order remains. Chinese know it intuitively, who is most senior, who is less senior. The Western side has to make those decisions before they arrive, so that when they sit at a conference table, when they sit at a banquet table, rather than entering like a mob of sheep, they will have a clear understanding of where they sit within the order of seniority in their delegation, so that the Chinese side can also clearly and easily identify that. The final thing I want to discuss this evening, and I'm a little bit over time, I'm sorry, is tigers and flies. When Xi Jinping came to power, he talked about a tigers and flies campaign. What he was doing was signaling a move against the corruption that had grown within the Chinese political and business environment. And it was there. It was strong. There's no question about it. Now, people initially thought, particularly in the Western narrative, that the Tigers and Flies campaign was about getting rid of President Xi's rivals. And to some extent, that was true. But the campaign is much, much wider than that. Yes, the big tigers have been held to account, but so have thousands upon thousands of flies, of little minor corrupt officials within the provincial governments, within government departments. The Tigers and Flies campaign is genuine, and it has major political consequences. So there was a time, 10 years ago, for instance, when expensive gifts that could be for personal use were routinely exchanged. It was perhaps a form of corruption, and at times it was genuine corruption. Now, offering such a gift, an expensive gift that perhaps is primarily for personal use, is a sign of corruption and deeply embarrassing to the recipient on the other side. Not just embarrassing, but represents a significant risk for the person on the other side. Good manners may suggest that the gift has to be accepted, but better knowledge of the importance of the Tigers and Flies campaign will suggest that that gift should never have been given in the first place. So now, gifts that are given, which are routinely exchanged, tend to be of lower value and most definitely suitable for public display as distinct from private consumption. An example, in the past, for instance, sometimes watches were exchanged. Now, watches were clearly for personal consumption. It's not something that you would hang on the office wall. Now, you might exchange a painting, for instance. Now, that's clearly something that can hang on an office wall. It might also hang on a private wall, but at least it has the ability to be hung on an office wall, whereas a watch, for instance, does not have that ability. Tigers and Flies campaign is ongoing. Xi is determined to root out corruption as much as he possibly can. There will always be a level there. And some people will make a choice to take that particular corrupt path. But in terms of everyday operation of business, the Tigers and Flies campaign has real consequences for your partners in China. It's something you need to be aware of. Gift giving is an essential part of developing the business relationship. Deciding on the size and the appropriate nature of the gift in a post-COVID environment, in this new nationalistic environment, becomes just as important as it was in the past, except that the nature of the gift changes, the size of the gift changes, the way in which it's given also changes. I've gone a bit longer than I anticipated. My apologies for that. I hope that you have a range of questions that you're ready to ask at this point in time. I've only touched the very surface of the operating environment in China, the way that that's changed in a post-COVID environment, given you some very brief strategies amongst a whole lot of others that I've discussed that talk about the ways that we as small business enterprises are able to enter the China market and engage with our Chinese counterparts when we don't enjoy the advantages that come with the larger international corporates. We have to operate differently. There are essential elements of success. I have not had time to cover more than just a handful, and even then, just briefly. Thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Guppy. So now we'll be moving on to the Q&A. And we thank you to all those in the audience who have sent in questions. So I'll be reading them out for our speaker, Mr. Guppy, to address. So the first question that we have from the audience comes from Kanupriya. Kanupriya says, thank you very much for that enlightening presentation. My question pertains to the sustainability of the BRI framework in an increasingly polarized post-COVID world.
Thank you. BRI has been in place for nearly a decade, moving on towards that. So it's well established. Although BRI is not making the same headlines in China as it used to, it's still very much integrated into all sorts of Chinese activities. So, for instance, let's take Indonesia as an example. Indonesia was infamous for its paper-based import system. If they were importing goods from overseas, there was a massive range of papers that had to be filled out, and there were small payments that had to be made at many stages of that process. That's been replaced by Indonesia with a single window entry system, which is all blockchain based. And that has eliminated the need for all that paperwork and the corruption that went with it. That single window entry system is compatible with Chinese BRI. The same sorts of cross-border blockchain processes are being used for the express trains, the freight trains that are running from Xi'an through to Frankfurt. There are still one or two borders that are not fully on board in terms of the BRI, in terms of the blockchain clearances. But my understanding is that they will soon come on board. So already there's a whole range of soft infrastructure processes in place, 5G standards, AI standards, blockchain standards, the way in which the digital DCEP currency will work and so on, that show that BRI is continuing to roll out. It continues to play a major role within the Chinese environment. We're also seeing some of this in relation to recent decisions in the last week or two around US listings of companies like Didi in the US and so on, the control of data and data flows, the way in which that data will be managed. So BRI is alive and well. It's not out there building bridges and railways all the time. It's all of this background software work, trade relationship work that's taking place. So what we're likely to see with RCEP, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Program that was signed several months ago now, is that RCEP will be looking at the way that those existing BRI protocols are rolled out across the trading region, particularly through Asia and particularly through Central Asia. That's where I'll leave it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question comes from Megan Yo. So Megan asks, hi, Mr. Guppy. Thank you for the presentation. My question is, how can SMEs whose business models and branding are primarily focused on sustainability and/or ethical values balance between breaking into the China market and maintaining their values? So for example, cruelty-free beauty products that want to go into China's large market, but will need to do animal testing if they want to do so, which goes against their core values. What's your take on that?
Okay, so there are several parts of that answer. China's commitment to clean and green is getting stronger and stronger. And there are emerging and developing regulations around what they will accept and what they won't accept. However, as a general rule, it tends to be cleaner and greener. That's where the progression is going rather than backwards. In terms of animal testing on products, there have been changes made around that, particularly in terms of cosmetics and medicines and so on. I'm not fully across those latest changes. It's not an area I work in. But the opportunities that exist for the cosmetics industry and the associated industries that have relied on animal testing in the past have become much larger. There is a recognition that this is a legitimate part of the process. Now, in terms of ethical investing within a Chinese environment, that's a choice that we can make engaging with the counterparty on the China side. And there is now a greater willingness for the acceptance of ethical or green investment engagements to take place, because this is increasingly part of national Chinese policy. Now, I'm sorry if that answer was a little bit waffly, because I'm not precisely across the changes that have taken place in terms of animal testing of products, but I am aware that those changes have taken place and that generally they've been welcomed by the cosmetics industry.
Thank you, Mr. Guppy. Actually, Megan has followed up with another question on another part of your presentation. So the question is, you mentioned that gift giving is an important part in Chinese business culture, but given that Xi Jinping has embarked on an anti-corruption campaign, how can SMEs cultivate a real and meaningful business partnership with Chinese companies without getting into trouble?
Right, and that's an important question. So there are two parts of that. The first, and let's take this at a political level, and we do the same at a business level. So we've got a delegation that's taking place, either a visiting Chinese delegation to our home country, or we are visiting as a delegation to China. The organisers need to get in contact with each other, not the leaders, and discuss the gifts that will be exchanged, what is appropriate and not appropriate. So we'll come up with a set of suggestions. From the Chinese side, it may be a gift of tea or a tea set or something similar. There are two reasons for doing this. One is to make sure that the gift that you give to the delegation is not disproportionately large or smaller than the gift that the Chinese delegation is giving to your leader. So this background discussion means that the gifts are at a suitable level of value and that they don't cross the boundary into something that could be seen as a corrupt gift or an enticement to corruption. So the background discussion is particularly important. Now, this actually leads me on to a bit of a wider discussion, and I'll just take a moment to do it. We often talk about the Chinese parliament as being a rubber stamp. Yeah, they just stand up and they rubber stamp what's put up in front of them. And to some extent, that's true in the sense that, yes, there is very often very little debate about the propositions that are put forward. But that conceals a widespread, spirited discussion that has taken place prior to the presentation of that final resolution within the Congress or within the equivalent of the Parliament. Where our discussion in the West takes place in public, the discussion of policy options and so on in China takes place largely amongst specialist think tanks. And the objective of the think tank, most of them university-based, is to have all of or part of their proposals adopted by the central party. And if it is adopted, then that university gets a higher reputation and gets more funding. The point that I want to make is that there is vigorous discussion in the background so that when it comes to the public situation in the Parliament, in giving and receiving gifts, that's all been decided quietly and calmly, although sometimes there's strong conflict, in the background. So there is no conflict, there is no problems, there are no concerns when the actual public event takes place. So what to give as a gift? It's always a difficult question. What you want to do with your gift is to show sincerity. You want to show commitment. You want to show that you are opening a relationship. So the meaning of the gift in some ways is more important than what the gift actually is. For example, at the turn of the century, the Qing dynasty issued a whole range of bonds for the construction of railways and so on. And they were European bonds. They were issued by European bankers on behalf of the Qing dynasty. They are now worthless, but they are an important part of Chinese history. So one of the gifts that I gave when I was first making a whole range of connections was to have one of these bond certificates framed. Its physical value was very small. Its emotional value, its historical value was much, much greater, and it was received accordingly. Getting the right gifts is a difficult process. Do you want to reflect your company? Do you want to reflect your country? Do you want to reflect your culture? Discuss with your counterparts both the size of the gift, the quality of the gift, and the nature of the gift, because they are just as concerned as you are about what they should give you as a visiting delegation. So no hard and fast rules, but discussion in the background is essential.
Thank you, Mr. Guppy. Maybe we can take one last question and then we will wrap up today's webinar. An hour has flown by very quickly. So the last question that comes from the audience comes from Charlotte Yap. So the question is, hello, Mr. Guppy. When people do business in China, they tend to approach it with certain stereotypes in mind. So have you encountered any of them, and have you seen them backfire before?
Where to start? Thank you for the question. Where to start? And I might just say here that the stereotypes held by Singaporean Chinese in some ways are just as inappropriate as the stereotypes held by Americans or by Europeans. Where to start in terms of stereotypes? It's really, there are so many stereotypes to start from. So perhaps I won't go there. Perhaps what I'll say is the important thing is to go into the situation with an open mind. Take people as you meet them. Don't assume that there is a slyness, that there is a hidden agenda, that there is a corrupt intent behind everything that is being done. Just as in any business environment, there will be good people, there will be bad people. There will be people who are honest, there will be people who are dishonest. Your task, as in any business meeting in any country, is try to identify those that are honest and those that are reliable. One of the most essential tools of that is a business meal. And that starts off perhaps as a formal banquet. And you can be assured, just as you are assessing all of your partners, all the people on the other side of the table, they are also assessing you. They are looking for clues that you understand what they are doing, that you understand and appreciate the environment that you're working in, that you understand that you can reach out with a hand of friendship, because friendship is particularly important in the Chinese business environment. It is important in many ways to put aside what you think you know and accept what develops. And I'll finish with one particular example. When I was invited first time to China to speak at the Shanghai Futures Exchange. And I was invited because of my international reputation in terms of markets and market analysis and the techniques that I used. And I assumed that the methods and the approaches that I used in public presentations in Singapore, in Australia, in America, in London would be exactly the same that I could use within the China environment. But things didn't go down as well as I expected. I knew that within those Western environments, and I count Singapore and Malaysia within that, that my presentation style and approach and methods were good, but they didn't hit the right buttons for a Chinese audience. Now I've got a choice. I can sit back and say, well, they're wrong. I know what I've been doing. I've been doing this for 20 odd years and I'm fairly good at it. So they'll have to adjust. Or I can sit back and say, something's wrong here. I'm not making the connections with the audience that I need to make, which means I can't get across the message that I want to get across. And I can't blame my translator because my translator is good. So I have to learn to adjust and to understand what the audience is looking for, what they're expecting. And it's only when you step back and say, I have to learn, I have to understand a different cultural environment, even though I think I might know it. And I'd been working in Singapore and Malaysia for 10 or 15 years before I first went to China. So I thought that I was comfortable with a Chinese audience. I had to put all of those preconceptions to one side. So to answer your question more succinctly, we have stereotypes that sit in place that are well known and obvious, put them to one side. More insidious is the stereotypes we have that we don't yet recognize. And we need to be alert to these influencing the way that we behave and the way that we act. We need to look at our partners, the people that we're dealing with, and look at them without those preconceptions as far as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Guppy. I think that was incidentally a very good note to wrap up this Q&A session on. There are many things that we still have yet to learn, but China is a land of great opportunity, as you have shown us as well. So we thank you, Mr. Daryl Guppy, for taking the time to share your thoughts and insights with us. And we also thank you all in the audience for attending tonight. I'm happy to let you know that you can enjoy a 20% discount on the selling price of Mr. Guppy's book, China for SMEs, Essential Elements of Success, from now until 31st July 2021. The discount code can be found in the chat box, and you can refer to it at your own time. So we thank you again very much for joining us for today's session, and we hope to see you again at a future event. Thank you.